Hey, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into some ancient wisdom that feels surprisingly relevant,
Huh.
for navigating all the confusion and complexity today.
hmm
We've got a stack of articles and commentaries here, all focused on the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita.
Right.
And our mission in this deep dive is basically to take these sources, unpack the core insights about facing confusion, understanding our true selves, and finding a path to clarity and effective action. In this complex world,
Yeah.
we'll be drawing lessons directly from Arjuna's journey and Krishna's guidance, just as it's presented in these texts.
And the goal here, I think, is really to go beyond just like summarizing the text.
Mm-hmm.
We want to help you, our listener, connect the dots and see how this ancient wisdom from, thousands of years ago
Yeah.
can speak directly to the doubts, the fears, the challenges you might be facing right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's about understanding how something written for, a warrior on a battlefield can actually serve as a blueprint for our own inner struggles, moving from confusion to clarity.
Okay, let's jump right in then. Starting where the Gita itself starts. Arjuna's state on the battlefield.
Right. His predicament.
Yeah, the sources describe his plight vividly. He's completely overwhelmed, like literally unable to stand, his mind reeling, seeing only misfortune. That's right there in the first chapter.
It's a powerful image. Total breakdown.
Totally. And he's convinced that fighting, even if he wins, it won't bring him happiness or pleasure because, well, it means killing his own family, his teachers.
People he loves and respects.
Exactly. And there's the fear, the thought of the sinful reactions from doing something like that. It just terrifies him. He's like paralyzed by his material attachments, his relationships, his desires for peace, for happiness, but on his terms.
Mm-hmm.
And it's completely clouding his judgment, his ability to act, just stuck.
And what's really key here, I think, according to the sources, is that Arjuna's problems aren't presented as like unique to him or just about this specific war.
Mm-hmm.
His attachments, his hopes, his fears, his guilt, his confusion, they're framed as universal human problems. It's like the text is holding up a mirror, isn't it? Saying, see, you feel this way too sometimes.
So it's less about the external battlefield, more about the internal one. Is that the idea?
Exactly. That's the perspective offered. Arjuna's psychological struggle is paramount.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe even, more difficult than fighting external enemies.
Mm-hmm.
It's the mind, after all, that creates our reality of friends and enemies, that assigns value, that gets overwhelmed by all these emotions.
Okay.
The sources really suggest fighting the mind is presented as a much, much harder battle than fighting actual people.
And this kind of confusion, this paralysis, it isn't limited to someone on a literal battlefield or even just someone facing like huge life decisions.
Yeah, not at all.
The sources highlight that even people on a dedicated spiritual path, they face similar doubts. You might question your duty to the world versus, say, your spiritual practice, or feel completely despondent after years of effort without seeing obvious results. That feeling of, is this even working?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's actually an anecdote in one of the commentaries about an intelligent friend, someone in an ashram, who, after 20 years of dedicated spiritual life, faced immense pressure, health issues, and suddenly started doubting everything, even the existence of God.
Wow, after 20 years.
Yeah, it just underscores that deep-seated doubt can arise even after really significant effort. It's not just a beginner thing.
That's a powerful point. And it's interesting how Krishna's teaching begins right there, meeting Arjuna exactly where he is in that state of profound confusion.
Yes.
The Gita is presented as this guide that meets you at your current level, your current understanding, and helps you ascend gradually, step by step. It doesn't expect you to make these sudden, impossible leaps.
Right. It starts from that very human point of confusion. And from there, the Gita shifts gears a bit to lay down a fundamental understanding of reality itself.
Okay.
Drawing from the commentary on Sankhya philosophy, the sources note that our perception, what we get through our senses, it's often deeply distorted. Well, we rely on sensory reports, right? But these are filtered, they're galvanized, they're often misleading. What we see, what we experience, isn't always what is. There's a layer between us and reality.
And this connects directly to one of our most fundamental fears, doesn't it? The fear of death.
Absolutely.
Even though we know intellectually physical death is inevitable, this body will perish.
Right.
We still fear it intensely.
And the source explains this fear stems directly from our intense but ultimately mistaken identification with the perishable body and mind.
Ah.
The true self, the soul, it's called Atman or Purusha in these texts, is described as this immortal core, completely distinct from the physical form.
Like wearing clothes.
Exactly like that. Think of the body as a garment the soul wears. Or another analogy used is like seeing redness in a pure crystal.
Hmm.
The redness isn't the crystal itself, it's just a reflection from something outside it.
Okay.
The soul's journey isn't really about the body's end, but more a movement towards a kind of finality, like a river meeting the ocean, potentially the end of endless rebirth.
The sources also bring in these concepts like Prakriti and Purusha. Can you unpack that a bit more simply for us?
Sure. Think of Prakriti as the principle of matter, nature, the fundamental stuff of the universe. It's inherently active, always changing, but it doesn't have consciousness on its own.
Okay, active but not aware.
Right. And then Purusha is the principle of pure consciousness, awareness. But it's inherently inactive, just the witness.
It's an active consciousness.
Yeah. The texts describe them as beginningless aspects of the supreme Purusha, or God. What we experience as conscious activity in ourselves, this blend of awareness and action, is explained as a kind of juxtaposition, a mix-up, or co-presence of these two principles within our body-mind structure.
Mix-up.
Yeah, in the sense that pure consciousness gets entangled with active matter. Even our physical body is seen as this composite structure, needing some kind of cement of cohesion to hold it together, suggesting it's not this single solid thing at its core.
And it's mentioned, drawing from later chapters, I think, that the Supreme Lord is actually equally present in all beings, from the smallest ant to an elephant, humans, gods.
Yes, exactly. Despite the vast differences in their physical forms, their mental structures, their subtle and gross bodies, as the text put it, the underlying life force, that divine essence, is common to all.
Like sunlight.
Precisely the analogy used. Like sunlight appearing colored when it passes through different colored glasses. The light itself is the same. Its manifestation just looks different depending on the medium. The divine presence is the same, regardless of the being.
That brings us to a really fascinating point about God's closeness in the Gita. The sources note this shift in perspective. In the earlier chapters, maybe 1 through 6, God might seem like this distant, supreme being.
Right, somewhat transcendent.
Yeah. But by chapter 7, God is presented as immanent meaning both within us and throughout all of creation, right here, right now.
Closer, much closer.
And then chapter 8 talks about reaching God after death. So this progression, it naturally leads to a pretty important question for you, the listener. Can God be reached while alive? And the text explores paths towards that possibility.
And moving from, understanding reality to actually engaging with it, our sources present a core teaching that can feel, well, pretty counterintuitive at first.
Okay.
This is this famous verse. Your duty is to act, that is karma jivadhikaras, but you have no right to expect any result or particular fruit to accrue from your action.
Oof. That sounds harsh. Like working without getting paid or working for a cruel boss.
Huh. Yeah, it can feel that way initially, but the commentary is quick to clarify that God is not cruel. This teaching isn't about being mean. It's intrinsically linked to understanding the universe as one single interconnected body.
Interconnected. How so?
Well, every individual, every single action is involved in the structure and the functioning of this whole cosmic system. We're not isolated units.
Okay, so karma yoga, the yoga of action, it's explained then as living in the world through this principle of mutual sacrifice, understanding, cooperation.
Exactly.
Among the world itself, us, and the divine.
Precisely. When action is undertaken with that understanding, integrated into the larger cosmic flow, and dedicated without attachment to the personal outcome, it makes one valuable and worthwhile, not just in the eyes of other people, but crucially in the eyes of the divine. It aligns you with the cosmic order.
And Krishna uses this very principle to urge Arjuna to fight, doesn't he? He reframes the whole situation. He even presents it as a kind of win-win.
Ah, the win-win argument.
Right. If you're killed in battle, you attain heaven. If you win, you enjoy the earthly kingdom. But the deeper point is fulfilling your duty, your dharma.
Absolutely. And Krishna directly counters Arjuna's grief over his loved ones using Atmajnana, the knowledge of the soul.
Right.
He explains, look, they are eternal souls. The body's death is inevitable anyway. Avoiding your duty won't change that fundamental reality.
So fulfilling duty becomes key.
It becomes paramount, especially in such a critical moment. And the sources also give this broader context for any action, listing 5 factors involved.
5 factors.
Yeah, including the central role of the cosmic will, or Daivam. Empires can rise and fall, not just because of human effort or mistakes, but based on whether their existence is sanctioned or not by this supreme will.
Wow.
Our individual actions are just part of this much larger divinely influenced tapestry. We're not the sole doers.
And they briefly contrast different motivations for action too, right? Like tamasic action.
Yes, action undertaken from delusion, sort of ignoring your actual capacity or the potential harm it might cause, that's described as tamasic. It's impulsive, ill-considered action driven by ignorance. Not good.
Okay, makes sense.
Now let's swing back to that internal battlefield we talked about earlier, mastering the mind.
Right. The harder battle.
Definitely. The sources heavily emphasize how difficult this is. The mind, that's what creates our internal reality of friends and enemies. It generates attachment and aversion. And the text highlights the mind's particular weakness when we are alone, stripped of external distractions. That's when it can really run wild.
So true detachment isn't necessarily about, like, running off to a cave. It's detaching the mind from its own dictates.
Exactly. It's detachment from the pull of the mind's likes and dislikes. And it's clearly stated that desire and hatred, ikadvesha, these are the primary culprits. They lead to delusion, to a kind of split personality where you want one thing but do another. The sources suggest it feels almost impossible for our thoughts to be completely untouched by these two forces, desire and hatred. They color everything.
So if the mind is such a powerful, potentially wild force, what technique do the sources suggest for actually controlling it? It sounds kind of hopeless otherwise.
Well, not hopeless, but it requires a specific approach. The method suggested is gradual. It's likened to fencing a wild bull.
Fencing a bull, okay.
Yeah, you don't try to conquer it by brute force all at once. You set limits, gradually restricting its movements, its field of operation.
So applied to the mind.
It translates to setting limits on desires. You don't just indulge everything. You allow only those that are permissible or justifiable according to higher principles. Slowly, patiently, you bring the mind under conscious control. It's a persistent effort, not a quick fix.
And what about the source of joy? Where does that come from, according to these texts?
This is fundamental.
Yeah.
It explicitly states that real, lasting joy comes from within, not from external objects, not from sense experiences.
Not from getting what you want.
Well, that's contrasted with what's called rajasic happiness, the happiness you get from sense contact. Getting that thing you wanted, tasting that food, feeling that pleasure.
Yeah, feels good.
Feels like nectar at first, absolutely. But the text warns it inevitably ends in sorrow or restlessness and has negative consequences, like binding you further to the cycle of rebirth. Anything external that has a beginning will have an end. True, lasting joy, the sources insist, must be cultivated internally, independent of external circumstances.
The sources also offer encouragement, right? For overcoming doubt and despondency, which seem inevitable on any path like this.
Oh, yes, definitely. There's a strong message that effort in yoga, or really any sincere spiritual or self-improvement endeavor, is never lost.
You never lost.
Never. It's like accumulating assets in a bank account. They're carried forward, even, the text suggests, across lifetimes. What you build, you keep.
That's reassuring.
And there's a beautiful analogy used, too. The night is darkest just before the sunrise. This implies that sometimes, just when you feel most despondent, most lost in doubt, maybe that means illumination is actually just around the corner. Like, the Buddha's enlightenment supposedly came after his deepest struggle.
Right, don't give up when it feels toughest.
Exactly. And doubt and ignorance are explicitly linked. They need the sword of insight, which is knowledge, understanding to dispel the misconceptions and establish yourself firmly in yoga.
And the call to action isn't gentle, is it?
Not at all. It's get up, be bold, bravo, O hero Arjuna. It requires real courage to face those inner obstacles, those doubts and fears.
Okay. And finally, on this section, the sources touch upon this contrast between divine and demoniacal natures.
Yes, they list key qualities. Divine qualities include things like fearlessness, purity of mind, self-control, compassion, the virtues.
Got it.
Demoniacal qualities are things like ego, pride, anger, greed, ignorance, the things that drag us down. And importantly, when you're faced with doubts about the right course of action, Scripture is presented as the final authority, the ultimate guide to help discern the right path from the wrong one.
Okay, shifting gears a bit now to connecting with the divine itself. The sources state pretty clearly that God is the ultimate origin, the sustenance of everything.
Yes, the ground of all being.
And there's this idea of a guiding hand operating through the cosmos, that the highest help available comes from universal intelligence.
Precisely. There's an order and intelligence pervading everything, and aligning with that is the highest form of health.
What I find fascinating here, and the sources mention this, is the idea that God descends as avatars, these divine incarnations.
Like Krishna.
Yeah, not just in human form like Krishna, but also through events like wars or epidemics when there's great disharmony in the cosmos.
Right. It broadens the concept of divine intervention.
Totally. It shows God's manifestations are myriad. They're not limited by our preferences. We might like the gentle form of Krishna, but maybe not the terrifying form of Narasimha, the man-lion avatar. But both are seen as divine descents.
And the purpose.
The purpose is explicitly stated. This descent of God is for the ascent of man, to provide a pathway, an example for humanity's spiritual evolution.
Makes sense. The sources also describe different types of devotees, right? People who approach God for different reasons.
Yeah, there are those who are distressed, seeking relief from suffering. There are seekers of knowledge, wanting to understand, and those seeking material gain or success.
The usual suspects.
Very much. But the Janani, the knower, is highlighted as the best among them.
Why is the knower considered the best?
Because, the text explains, they desire only God. Not something from God, like relief or wealth or even knowledge about God. They want God for God's own sake.
Pure devotion.
Right. Though it's also mentioned that God, being supremely compassionate, grants even petty requests to these lesser devotees. But the text does call worshiping different gods for specific boons, like, praying to one deity for wealth, another for health. It calls that a lesser religion compared to seeking the supreme directly.
Interesting distinction. And God's glories are said to be manifested everywhere.
Absolutely, throughout all of creation. From the simplest things, like the taste in water, the brilliance in the sun.
The essence of things.
Exactly. To the essence of language being the sacred sound Amkara. And Japa Yajna, chanting God's name, being considered the greatest sacrifice.
Easier than complex rituals, perhaps.
Maybe. The source gives us an amazing example of a sage manifesting a huge feast for thousands of people just through divine power, drawing energy even from seemingly inert things like a stone. It illustrates how divine power is latent everywhere and can potentially be accessed.
Wow. And you mentioned terrifying forms earlier. The source recalls Arjuna's vision of the cosmic form in chapter 11.
Yeah, which was overwhelming, truly terrifying for him. The text uses phrases like eternal terror. It revealed God's immeasurable, timeless, all-pervading nature. A form shown to be superior even to the creator Brahma.
A mind-blowing experience, literally.
Totally. And the crucial, almost paradoxical insight drawn from this vision is that human action, which is always bound by the limitations of space and time, cannot directly touch this timeless, unconditioned eternity.
Say more about that.
Well, perishable deeds, things we do within time, no matter how grand or noble they seem, they cannot, by their very nature, reach the unconditioned reality which is beyond time. How could actions limited by time ever lead to something completely beyond time? It's a fundamental difference in nature.
That's a really profound point.
Yeah.
So, given that limitation of action, what approaches do the sources present for connecting with the divine?
Two main paths are highlighted. One is the path of devotional worship, bhakti yoga, worshiping God as the supreme person. This is presented as generally easier, especially for those of us who still strongly identify with our physical body and mind. It gives a focus for love and devotion.
Okay, devotion to a personal God. And the other?
The other is the more difficult path, jnana yoga. It involves withdrawing the senses, withdrawing the mind, and focusing intently on the imperishable transcendent essence, the formless absolute. Much harder to grasp, harder to practice.
Right, the path of knowledge and meditation on the formless. And if that intense concentration is too hard.
Well, a lesser, but still valid method mentioned is repeated practice, abhyasa yoga. Just consistently, persistently turning the mind back towards the divine again and again, even if you can't maintain perfect focus. Keep trying.
Practice makes progress, if not perfection.
Okay. And what about the qualities of someone who has advanced significantly on this path, a realized soul, an advanced yogi? How are they described?
They're described as having this deep contentment. The Sanskrit term is yachalavhasatu, basically satisfied with whatever comes their way spontaneously without striving.
Contentment.
What else?
Calmness. Indifference to the dualities that usually disturb us so much, like praise versus censure, friend versus enemy, seeing a nugget of gold as no different really from a boulder.
Equanimity.
Exactly. They have this firm determination, a resolve, like, I shall attain God in this very birth, a powerful will.
Wow.
Their mind and intellect are wholly dedicated to God, may arpitamana buddhia, and crucially, the text says something fascinating. They don't shrink from the world, and the world doesn't shrink from them.
What does that mean? The world doesn't shrink from them.
It suggests, I think, that our inner state and our behavior towards the world actually conditions how the world behaves towards us. If you approach the world with fearlessness and equanimity, it responds differently than if you approach it with anxiety and aversion.
That's a very interesting psychological and spiritual point. Our inner state shaping our outer experience.
Yeah. And how does the Source describe the ultimate culmination, truly knowing God as He is?
The ultimate goal. It's described not like one entity observing another, like me looking at you. It involves the complete annihilation of the egoistic individual self.
Annihilation.
Yes. You enter the absolute, merge into Brahman, when your separate individual existence ceases. When the soul merges in God, like a drop in the ocean.
So if you're still there as a distinct you.
If you're still present as a distinct you, thinking of God as some independent entity you are looking at or interacting with, the text implies you are still outside that ultimate state of non-dual knowing. Knowing God as He is means your individual self dissolves into that.
That's a lot to wrap your head around.
It is deep stuff.
But one simple yet profound takeaway mentioned is just listening. Simply listening to the wisdom of the Gita with faith, and without malice or doubt. Even that can lead to liberation and higher states.
Just opening yourself to the teaching is presented as incredibly powerful in itself.
So bringing all this ancient wisdom into practical application into daily life, the Source suggests that when our work is done not just for personal gain, but as this impulsion from our spirit.
Like an inner calling.
Yeah, aimed at regeneration, at helping others. That work becomes religion. It's presented as a fundamental misreading of values to think God is somehow separate from our worldly activities, our jobs, our families.
Integration, not separation. What disciplines support this integration?
Important ones mentioned include self-control, dhamma, sacred studies, swadhyaya, like reading scripture or reflecting, austerity, tapas, which is more about conserving and focusing energy than harsh self-punishment and straightforwardness. Yeah, aligning your thoughts, words, and actions, being congruent, authenticity.
Okay. And the significance of Om Tat Sat. You hear that phrase a lot.
Right. It's explained as a triple designation of Brahman, the absolute reality, and it's used traditionally when performing actions like sacrifice, charity, and austerity.
The key actions.
Yes, specifically to dedicate them to the divine without expecting any fruit or result for yourself. The phrase tadicinapi sadhya phala is used doing it without aiming at the fruit. You do the action because it's right, it's obligatory, offering it up with that invocation.
Dedicating the action itself. Okay. And the paths of sannyasa and tyaga are revisited for breaking free from karmic bonds.
Yes. Sannyasa is described specifically as abandoning actions motivated by desire, kamyana karmat kanyasa, giving up the things you do just because you want something out of them.
Right.
Tyaga is broader. It's abandoning the fruit of all actions, sarvaka paramaphalatika, not just the desire-driven ones. You still act, performing your duties, but you relinquish the attachment to the outcome entirely.
Letting go of results.
Exactly. And the sources use this beautiful analogy. Awakening to the consciousness of the eternal absolute dissolves sins and mistakes. Just like waking up from a dream instantly dissolves all the mistakes and consequences you experienced within that dream. They just vanish because the context has shifted.
Poof, gone.
Yeah. And finally, this powerful idea that God has neither friend nor foe. God is equally accessible to all beings, like sunlight and rain falling on everyone.
Impartial.
Completely. God is simple, the text says, and accessible. Our ability to receive that accessibility, that grace, depends entirely on how open we are, how much we turn towards it.
So it's on us to open the door, essentially.
Seems like it.
Yeah.
And a very powerful concluding point in the sources ties into this. What you deeply expect, what you deeply believe, what you consistently think, that has the power to materialize, especially divine grace.
Like attracts like.
Kind of. Whatever we think and believe with real conviction, the source says, shall take place in our lives. Our consciousness shapes our reality.
Wow. That really was a deep dive, wasn't it?
It really was. We went all the way from Arjuna's state of complete battlefield confusion, paralyzed by doubt and attachment, through these incredibly profound insights on the nature of reality, the self, right action, our connection with the divine, all drawn from these rich sources.
And it really is presented as this comprehensive blueprint. Yeah. Moving from that initial, very relatable state of confusion and doubt towards a potential state of clarity, purposeful action, and ultimately, inner transformation and maybe even realization.
Definitely not light reading or listening. Acknowledging the sheer depth of this material, we really invite you, our listener, to spend some time just pondering this journey, these ideas. Let them sink in.
Absolutely. And maybe to leave you with a final thought, something to mull over, John, directly from these core themes we've explored today.
Okay.
If God's nature, as it's described in these texts, is fundamentally inclusive thought, a total, all-encompassing awareness where nothing is excluded.
Right.
And human thinking is almost inherently exclusive. Right. We always have to focus on this by excluding that. We categorize, we separate.
Yeah, that's how our minds work.
Right. So what does that fundamental difference in the very nature of thinking mean for our capacity to truly comprehend the divine? And how does that inherent limitation or that paradox shape our spiritual striving and ultimately our understanding of ourselves?